Israel and the United States of America launched attacks against Iran, they plunged the country into chaos. In response, Iran launched a barrage of missiles and drones, plunging the entire region into chaos. Despite not taking part in the initial attacks, Gulf nations fell into the crosshairs of Iran's retribution. As the war has rumbled on from month to month, through intense engagements and periods of relative calm, Gulf states and their economies have continued to look nervously at the skies. While united in the opinion that Iranian airstrikes are bad, the two largest powers in the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, have fallen on different sides of the fence when it comes to how to proceed with the response and the future of the region. This week, how has the war impacted the Gulf's two biggest economies? How is the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the UAE playing out in the shadow of the US-Israeli war in Iran? And when the war ends, what would be their preferred outcomes? My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to the New Arab Voice. The war against Iran, which started on February 28th, when the US and Israel launched a joint attack on the country's towns, cities, leadership, and military, prompted a heavy response. Iran immediately fired off ballistic missiles and swarms of suicide drones. While their old adversary and the instigator of the war, Israel, certainly took some of Iran's anger, it was the Gulf that saw the most significant brunt of the attacks. According to figures released by the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, from the start of the war until early June, Gulf states have been targeted 7,028 times. The vast majority of these attacks have been drone attacks, around 5,300, and the rest missile attacks. Of these attacks, over half, or a little over 4,000, have targeted either the UAE or Saudi Arabia, with the UAE coming off worse, feeling the sharp end of 2,846 attacks, and Saudi Arabia around 1,200. For context, Israel was targeted by Iran around 650 times between the start of the war and when the shaky ceasefire came into effect on April 8th. It's worth pointing out that while the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been targeted thousands of times, the majority of these projectiles have been prevented from reaching their targets. But that does not lessen the seriousness or risk of these attacks, which have targeted both infrastructure and civilians, as well as US military assets. When you consider the Gulf, and perhaps the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, the first thing that might come to your mind is a huge pile of cash built on the profits from their huge oil reserves. But today, that pile of cash is slightly smaller, thanks to the war.
I think it's clear that the UAE has an economic model that very much depends on stability within the Emirates, and by extension, stability within the immediate neighborhood.
This is Giorgio Cafiero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics and adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University.
And therefore, the American-Israeli war on Iran and Tehran's retaliatory attacks, many of which have targeted the UAE, have done much to threaten and to put under pressure the Emirati economic model.
For years, the UAE has advertised and promoted itself as a desert oasis of luxury. Shining towers of glass and modernity, shopping for the fabulous, wealthy, and fabulously wealthy. A country where $1 million supercar is considered pedestrian. Missiles and drones do not gel with this image.
One sector that has certainly taken a big hit is tourism. We see this not only in the UAE, but really throughout all the GCC countries, and with tourism being important to the economy of Dubai, as well as other parts of the Gulf. This is a huge problem.
With tourism, the UAE has also seen its associated industries take a hit.
Other sectors have taken hits too. We know at the beginning of the conflict, the Gulf's aviation ecosystem was severely hurt, severely harmed by this conflict. We saw the targeting of some airports in the Gulf, and naturally, that had a huge impact.
The impact on Saudi Arabia has been similar, although not as pronounced.
The summer season is upon us now when there are going to be fewer visits anyway.
This is Christian Coates Ulrichsen, Fellow for the Middle East at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy.
But if this conflict is continuing until into the winter, into the fall and autumn and winter, there could be damaging implications for sort of non-religious tourism on the West Coast especially. Sporting events have been a major area where the Saudis have moved into.
On April 19th, Saudi Arabia was due to hold the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix in the Red City of Jeddah. But with the onset of the war and Saudi Arabia being targeted by the war, this was cancelled. While this sporting event was cancelled and likely had a negative impact on the kingdom's image as a steady, reliable sporting venue, other events have gone ahead.
We just had the AFC Asian Champions League have its final 8, quarterfinal, semi-final, and final in Saudi Arabia. The final had 60,000 people in the stadium. You couldn't imagine that happening in Doha or Dubai or Abu Dhabi right now, which goes to show again one of the advantages Saudi has is territorial depth.
Even a cursory glance at a map of the region will show you how much bigger Saudi Arabia is compared to its Gulf neighbours, and its sheer size is a form of defence in itself. Tourism and sporting spectacles do bring in the dollars for the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but of course it's not their main source of income. In spite of their efforts to wean their economies from hydrocarbons, both rely on oil money to varying levels. By now, you would have heard how the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has impacted oil-producing nations. While this is true, the UAE's geographic location in relation to the strait, and with Saudi Arabia's size, both nations have been spared the worst of this upheaval. Giorgio Cafiero.
The UAE, in terms of its energy sector, has been little spared compared to some of the other Gulf countries. I think UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, by not being dependent on the Strait of Hormuz, have definitely had some advantages over the other countries in the Gulf, including Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, which definitely depend on the Strait of Hormuz being open in order to export gas and oil.
Christian Coates Ulrichsen.
Well, Saudi Arabia has been less directly hit by the conflict in Iran than some of the other Gulf states because they have the pipelines that can transport 5 million barrels of oil for export to the West Coast, to the Red Sea, an additional 2 million for refining purposes. So there are workarounds that can bypass the Strait of Hormuz.
While they might have avoided the worst of the impacts from the closure of the strait, it does not mean that the energy sector has been left unscathed.
But nonetheless, the UAE's energy sector has certainly taken a hit. We have seen Iranian drones strike major energy facilities in the UAE. And I think probably throughout this upcoming period, the UAE is going to continue to be the Arab state that is most heavily targeted by Iran's missiles and drones. And probably the Iranian aggression against the UAE is going to become a fact of life for the foreseeable future until some of the more underlying issues in the region are addressed.
While Saudi Arabia can transport oil via a pipeline to shipping terminals on the Red Sea and then out to customers around the world, there are some things that cannot be shoved into a tube.
Where the Saudi economy has been hit is in the exports and the production of other commodities linked to the oil and gas sector, aluminum, for example, phosphates, both of which were being exported from the east coast of the Saudi Arabia on Ras Tanura, and Ras Al Khair on the Gulf. So again, subject to the restrictions on the Strait of Hormuz.
Between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, it is probably Saudi Arabia that has had to make more drastic decisions when it comes to cutting back on projects. Although many of those decisions were made before the start of the war.
Some of the more sort of fanciful projects that were all unveiled in 2021, 22, around the time of much higher oil prices the previous time, after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those are the projects that are being scaled back, if not suspended altogether. The line, I think, has been suspended. We may never see any of the line actually constructed. We saw the Mukab, the cube in Riyadh, be again suspended. Trojena, the potential winter resort that was supposed to have the 2029 Asian Winter Games. Again, that's been suspended. It's been announced that the games won't be held in Saudi Arabia. They'll take place in Kazakhstan.
Construction on the Mukab in Riyadh was suspended in late January of this year, while it was reported that Saudi Arabia had pulled out from hosting the 2029 Asia Winter Games in early February, weeks before the start of the war.
So we're already seeing NEOM, for example, being repurposed into logistics, into industrial supply center, potentially for AI and data centers as well, but much more taking advantage of the fact they've already built a port there, another port on the Red Sea, which has better connectivity to Northern Red Sea, with the Suez Canal, to Mediterranean through that. So I think what we're seeing is a continuation of an existing trend, which would have happened regardless of the war, but the war itself has made it even more urgent to really boost domestic supply chain resilience and industrial and manufacturing strength. So instead of building these fanciful projects for external investors, for international clients, probably going to see a doubling down on projects that really make sense from a Saudi economic point of view, which is probably no bad thing, actually.
Saudi Arabia was already scaling back economic projects before the start of the war. It has been the prevailing belief that for some time its more fanciful ideas, such as The Line, a 175-kilometre long futuristic city in the desert, would have to be reworked or abandoned altogether. The war was not the ignition for these decisions, but it is an accelerant. And the Saudi-Emirati economies have not only been shifting because of what's happening in Iran. Some shocks to the economy have come from closer to home. On April 28th, as Gulf nations were meeting in a show of solidarity and to discuss how they were to address the Iranian attacks, the UAE announced that it was to leave OPEC. Explaining the decision, the UAE's Minister of Energy, Suhail al-Mazroui, said, "First of all, this decision is a sovereign decision that came after extensive study. Its benefits to us are clear: flexibility and speed in decision-making in line with our national interests, as well as the interests of countries and companies that have invested in the United Arab Emirates, whose interests must be protected by us." The catchily named Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries is a cartel of oil-producing nations. Following the UAE's departure, there are now 11 countries in OPEC who act as a collective to influence the global oil markets and maximize profit. Together, OPEC nations account for around 38% of the world's oil production, but they hold just shy of 80% of the planet's oil reserves. So why did the UAE leave?
There was talk about the UAE leaving OPEC that started years ago, years before the war centered on Iran broke out in late February. The UAE has for some time been, or was for some time, one of the OPEC members that was not pleased with the production quotas. And this, in large part, has to do with the fact that the UAE is at a point in its economic development that is beyond where many of the other OPEC members are, and the UAE's economy functions very differently from, say, the Saudi economy that's very dependent upon oil prices. The UAE's economy is much more diversified, and therefore, I think just strictly from an economic perspective, the leadership in Abu Dhabi made calculations that continued membership in OPEC was not going to serve the interests of the UAE. But the timing of the Emirati exit is significant. I don't think that they left OPEC because of the American-Israeli war on Iran and the fallout, but it definitely created conditions that made the move more compelling for the UAE.
The UAE and Saudi Arabia are both oil-producing nations, but their economies do work differently. Without boring you with all the details, the UAE has managed to diversify its economy to a much greater level than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is trying, hence all the Vision 2030 projects and wrestling and pop concerts. But it still falls behind the UAE on this path. Saudi Arabia needs to sell its oil at a certain price to meet the costs of these projects, but also to maintain its welfare spending for its citizenry. OPEC's control of the price of a barrel of oil mean that Saudi Arabia could ensure that its needs were met. The UAE is less reliant on such careful pricing. Being an OPEC meant that the UAE was limited about how much it could pump and the price that oil could be sold at.
Obviously, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the UAE had been heating up for a number of months. There's also something to say about the fact that Iran is a member of OPEC, and the UAE does not have an interest in being part of a cartel that also includes as a member a country that is attacking the UAE. And I think this was really about the UAE making it very clear to the whole world that its foreign policy decisions are going to be based on what Abu Dhabi sees as the national interests of the UAE, not based on certain abstract concepts of collective interests on the part of Arab states or oil-producing states.
Going forward, OPEC, and by extension Saudi Arabia, is going to enter a period of readjustment.
I think going forward, the Saudis will probably have increased power within OPEC just because they're even more of a dominant producer now within OPEC, now that one of the big other producers has left. I think the big question is, well, firstly, how does Saudi Arabia and Iran work together in OPEC? I mean, can they compartmentalize everything else that has happened and still work together within an oil framework? Will any other countries try to leave OPEC? Or is this a one-off, or will there be a stampede for the exit? Would Venezuela, for example, now under US influence, decide it chooses to leave, for example? Or what happens to Iraq if Iraq's overproduction, once we get back to some sort of normality, is an issue? Kazakhstan, outside OPEC, has been overproducing as well.
The UAE have only recently left, and it remains unclear how they intend to proceed.
I think one question to watch going forward is, to what extent will a UAE outside OPEC nevertheless informally, align with OPEC in general ways, or will the UAE just go straight to try to increase production to 5 or even 6 million barrels a day to make the most of what they want to do, which is to increase production quickly? If they do that straight away, once the situation becomes more regularized, that could really flood the market and lead to a precipitous decline in oil prices, which the Saudis would not want, because they still need oil revenues to pay for the Vision 2030 projects, now a decade or almost a decade of World Cup related projects as well.
There is the possibility that the UAE wants to drastically increase production and drive the price of a barrel down to effectively increase pressure on Saudi Arabia. It could be a means of the UAE creating leverage over Saudi Arabia. So far, we've seen no evidence of that. Yet, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been impacted by the war on Iran. Financially, but also by tragic losses of life. In many ways, they're in a similar situation. Neither asked for this war, but both have been forced to bear the cost of it. But are they viewing the war in the same fashion?
At that point, there was some expectation among certain analysts that the shared vulnerabilities to Iran and the fact that both Gulf countries were targets of Iran's missiles and drones would result in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi sort of setting aside their differences and coming together within the context of GCC unity shoring up. I think at the beginning of the conflict, there was something to say about that. And we obviously know that early on in the conflict, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, as well as UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed, had a phone conversation in which they expressed solidarity with each other and between their two countries. I think it would be very difficult to argue that the rivalry between these two countries is not playing out in a significant way amid this conflict. While both Saudi Arabia and the UAE obviously continue to share very, very serious concerns about Iranian attacks on GCC members, I definitely think we can say that the leadership in Abu Dhabi and the leadership in Riyadh have different approaches for how to deal with Iran.
It's always hard to say because there's been a lot of misinformation being spread in media circles, especially in the US, and not only in the US, in Israel as well, attributing to Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia or to Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi, remarks they may or may not have said. I think what we can say is that the UAE has been much more hawkish, much more willing to strike back at Iran. We've seen that when reporting about UAE allegedly taking part in airstrikes. The Saudis have been much more cautious, I think, continuing to be more cautious, have resisted any media speculation that they might be entering or getting involved in a much more direct way.
The war on the ground in Iran and at sea in the Strait of Hormuz is murky. So too is the war being fought in the media. During this war, claims have been made about both Saudi Arabia and the UAE taking direct action against Iranian forces inside Iran. For example, on May 12th, Reuters reported that Saudi Arabia had launched direct airstrikes against Iran in late March. The source of this information were unnamed Western and Iranian officials. Similarly, in May, the Wall Street Journal reported that the UAE had conducted dozens of strikes on Iran, again with no official confirmation or named sources, but also no official denial either. If these stories are true, it would be a major escalation from the defensive nature of the position that they have been publicly projecting. This confusing picture existed before the war. Prior to the start of the war, it was reported that Saudi Arabia was playing both sides of the fence, one in public and one in private.
I mean, I've also seen both sides of that argument, the Saudis urging restraint, the Saudis privately urging a more hawkish approach. Again, it's hard to tell who to believe in the sense that you see stories being briefed out to journalists from all sides. My inclination would be that the Saudis did not want this conflict, that they were urging restraint, they were calling for diplomacy. We saw the Saudi-Iran rapprochement in 2023 survive the Gaza war, survive the 12-day war last summer in 2025. I think it was not born out of a Saudi genuine. I mean, the Saudis didn't necessarily want to re-engage with Iran for the warmest of reasons. They just wanted to avoid any further escalation of tension where they could be caught in the middle. And I think that is exactly what has happened.
Until the memoirs of leaders and officials are written down over the next few decades, the truth will likely be difficult to pin down. Dealing with the facts on the ground, the US and Israel did go to war. And to date, the Iranian regime is surviving this war, to the surprise of both nations.
The Iranian government has certainly proven to be very resilient, and I don't say this to necessarily endorse it from any sort of moral standpoint, but just from a very Machiavellian point of view, the Iranians have, to their credit, been very successful in quickly internationalizing this conflict in ways that have forced the United States and US aligned states in the region to pay a very steep price for this war on Iran. The Iranians have certainly mastered strategic patience, asymmetric warfare, and they have been able to leverage their geography very efficiently, very effectively. And the fact that the Islamic Republic is still standing right now, and in a number of respects, we can say that Tehran has an upper hand in this conflict. I think that has forced not only policymakers in the UAE, but really policymakers throughout the region and the world at large to look at Iran differently. And I think when we get to the post-conflict phase, Iran is going to have a different position in the Middle East and by extension on the international stage at large.
We can identify two differing approaches: a more hawkish UAE approach and something closer to a more dovish Saudi approach. It's not their only difference. Another would certainly be their choice of allies. In September 2020, the UAE was one of a handful of countries that signed up to the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with Israel. Throughout Israel's genocide in Gaza, increasing violence in the West Bank, and invasions and occupations of Lebanon and Syria, the UAE has stuck with Israel and continued to move closer to Israel. This attitude has extended to their war against Iran. During the war, Israel has shared air defences with the UAE, and Israeli forces have been present in the UAE. For Saudi Arabia, these growing ties are a cause for concern.
There's no doubt that Saudi Arabia and some other Arab states do view the growing alignment and growing coordination between the UAE and Israel as a threat. Let's keep in mind that it was less than a year ago. It was just September 2025 when the Israelis bombed Doha, and many in Oman, Saudi Arabia, other GCC members did not see that as just an attack on Qatar, but really saw it as an attack on the GCC at large. And this marked the first time in which Israel waged military operations against a GCC state. Let's also keep in mind that the US is a security guarantor for all 6 GCC states, and that American security umbrella did nothing to protect Doha from the Israeli act of aggression.
I mean, I think there is, to some extent, concern about what it means for the GCC and for US Gulf, Saudi US relations, that sort of triangle. If the UAE and Israel decide to really go their own way, perhaps, then where does that leave Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states? And again, with the Saudi-US relations, we've seen Saudis also beginning to talk about the US as terms of not always being, in this maybe the first time in modern history, the US is acting in ways that have actually increased the insecurity of its partners in the Gulf, not contributing to security. And that's quite a shift, actually, if you think about a post-1990, post-Gulf War dynamic. So we've seen Saudis over the past 3 years, since October 7th in 2023, beginning to talk about Israel as a spoiler. In senior Saudi commentators, in newspaper articles, often journalists, there'll be senior journalist figures who would, or ex-officials, so it wouldn't necessarily be state representatives, but often talking about Israel in the same frame that in the past you'd hear Saudis talking about Iran as in acting as a spoiler for regional security. And that may well continue.
The Saudis view the ties between the UAE and Israel with unease. which is not lost on the UAE.
There's no doubt that the leadership in Abu Dhabi sees risks associated with being so close to Israel. This is especially the case after October 7th, 2023. We all know that the genocide in Gaza did nothing to pull the UAE away at all from Israel. To the contrary, these two countries have actually deepened ties in a number of domains since October 2023. But I think the calculation in Abu Dhabi is that the benefits outweigh the costs. From February 28th onward, the UAE feels that many Arab Islamic countries did not come to the UAE's defense when Iran was attacking the UAE with missiles and drones. The Israelis did come to help the UAE, and this informs an Emirati perspective that Israel is a country that the UAE should be working with closely. That's not a popular view in the region, but the experiences of the UAE since February 28th have led Abu Dhabi to view Israel as a country which will be an important security partner throughout this current conflict and throughout the future.
There is a sense of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. The UAE doesn't feel supported by its neighbours, so moves closer to Israel, which further alienates its neighbours, pushing the UAE closer to Israel. And it's not just Israel who are a cause for concern. While prompted by Israel, the US joined in this action with full gusto. This is a problem. The US is supposed to be the security guarantor for Saudi Arabia, indeed the whole Gulf, and now they have thrust these same countries into the crosshairs. What does Saudi Arabia do when the country that is supposed to be protecting them drags them into a war?
I think the Saudis are wondering what forms of leverage they have in Washington or elsewhere, just because the Saudi embrace of the Trump administration didn't prevent the US from beginning this conflict without really taking Saudi interest into account. So I think there's a lot of reflections taking place, I think, in Riyadh about what all these mean for Saudi regional policy going forward, and probably in Doha and other Gulf capitals as well.
If the war has irreversibly changed the Saudi-US relationship, then who can Saudi Arabia look to replace them?
And there's no country that can directly replace the US security and defense umbrella. That's part of the challenge. And in some ways, the importance of that umbrella has been shown by the fact that so many missiles and drones have been intercepted. Saudis, I think, have maybe been diversifying relationships, have not everything in one relationship riding on it. Maybe bringing in Asian partners, some of the European partners, deepening with the UK and France, but probably on a kind of case-by-case basis. I wouldn't imagine there would be a wholesale reliance on any one partner. We've seen localization of military supply chains beginning, when the Saudis announced in 2017 they're going to try and localize 50% of procurement by 2030. That was always, I think, an unrealistic target, but do they try to accelerate military localization? Do they try and begin to contribute more to their own defense and security? Again, this is probably going to be a longer term dynamic, not something they can easily replace in the short term.
The rivalry between the UAE and Saudi Arabia has taken many forms. Oil pricing competition, deciding to normalize with Israel or not, and the varying foreign groups they support around the region. We've seen this with the two countries supporting opposing sides of the war in Yemen, the war in Sudan, and Saudi Arabia has accused the UAE of supporting the separatist factions of the Druze community in Syria. But why? Is the UAE looking to supplant the dominant power of Saudi Arabia, or just underline its importance in the region?
I think it's important for us to recognize that all of the smaller GCC states at various times to various extents have feared Saudi hegemony on the Arabian Peninsula. And back beginning in 2017 with the second Gulf crisis, the blockade of Qatar. There was a lot of discussion about how Qatar was trying to really break away from the Saudi shadow, if you will, and assert its independence as a geographically small country in the Gulf that was capable of making decisions that were totally independent of Saudi Arabia. And obviously, the UAE joined Saudi Arabia in the blockading efforts. But what we can't deny is the fact is that similar to Qatar, the UAE also has a history of fearing Saudi hegemony.
For a while now, the UAE has been making it clear it will not sit back and be dictated to by Saudi Arabia, and that first in its mind is the UAE and then the Gulf.
And the UAE, I think, really, especially since the 2010s, has been very serious about making it clear that Abu Dhabi will not take orders from any country in the world, including Saudi Arabia, and that the UAE is going to make decisions based on what Abu Dhabi sees as the UAE's national interest. And if the Saudis support those decisions, that's great. And if the Saudis do not, the message is that Abu Dhabi really does not care. So I think the question is not so much about the UAE trying to replace Saudi Arabia as the dominant actor in the Gulf. It's more about the UAE is trying to create a new order in which at least Saudi Arabia is not necessarily Saudi Arabia is definitely not dictating terms to the UAE or other smaller GCC countries.
The US-Israeli war on Iran is going through a confused period. In just the last week, it's been off, then on, then off again, and then maybe on again. But one way or another, it will end. So what does Saudi Arabia and the UAE want from this? What do they want in Iran? What would they consider a good outcome for them? Christian Coates Ulrichsen.
I mean, it might be what's the least bad outcome, to be honest. And I think there's a consensus that the regime will survive in some shape and form. Clearly, it's survived so far. If anything, it's become even more hardline as officials that were killed in airstrikes have been replaced by more hardline figures in response. And so there's acknowledgement that they're going to have to live with a weakened but still hostile Iran for the foreseeable future. I think had there been a complete regime collapse, that could have been even more of a danger to the neighbors in the Gulf, just because you could have had competing power centers, radicalized factions fighting for control. And that could have been much more of a vacuum, at least if the regime remains in place. And there could be an incentive to have some sort of dialogue with neighboring states or with the international community. I think in terms of how this ends, the concern in Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states is that if Trump decides to walk away without fully reopening the Strait of Hormuz, if he decides that a ceasefire is enough in itself for his purposes, that is the risk. That we have this situation now, there's no deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And if that becomes de facto permanent, then that's going to be a concern. I mean, people remember the Suez Canal was closed, I think, for 8 years after 1967. Things could easily become a long-term situation if they're not addressed immediately. So I think the concern is that Trump may decide he can live with something that doesn't involve a fully kind of going back to the status pre-28th of February, and that would be the worry in the Gulf countries.
And final words to Giorgio Cafiero.
I think this is a point where the UAE and Israel do not have aligned interests. I have no doubt that Israel would like to see the Islamic Republic collapse and would not necessarily be concerned about the chaotic ways in which that would probably happen within the context of a war. The UAE, given its geographic proximity to Iran, is not in a position to not worry about what scenarios could result from the Islamic Republic collapsing. Let's just keep in mind that a situation in which the Iranian nation state fragments could lead to internal conflicts inside Iran that would spill into other countries, including GCC states, Turkey, Iraq, maybe countries in Central Asia. And there could be power vacuums inside Iran that get exploited by violent non-state actors. I would say that all 6 of the GCC states, including the UAE, do not want to see that scenario unfold. It's not about any love for the Islamic Republic. It's just about the fact that Iran is so close to home that the instability could severely harm the UAE. So I think probably what the UAE wants is for not necessarily the Iranian government to fall, but for the Islamic Republic to be very weakened, and for us to get to a point where the IRGC's activities are really confined to staying within Iran's own borders, and to get to a point where Iran ceases to have the power to play such an influential role throughout the region. Not an overthrow of the Islamic Republic, but to see the Islamic Republic weakened as much as possible. I think that's what Abu Dhabi dreams of.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodrich. Our theme music was by Omar Al-Film. The New Arab Voice will be back with a new episode shortly. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when a new episode drops. You can find the link in the show notes. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can also check out our social media accounts on Instagram and X, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.